I was halfway through my morning coffee when the call came in. Carol's voice on the radio sounded different than usual, more urgent, like something had gone wrong overnight. "Thomas, I need you in my office, now." I set down my mug and grabbed my jacket. The walk across the facility took about 5 minutes, past the equipment bays and the dive prep areas where a few of the other guys were checking gear. Nobody looked up. They were all focused on their own assignments. Carol's office was on the second floor of the main building. I knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer. He was standing behind his desk with a chart spread out in front of him, the kind we used for deep water operations. "Close the door," he said. I did, then walked over to see what he was looking at. The chart showed depth measurements and grid coordinates for a section of ocean about 20 miles offshore. Red marks indicated equipment locations, and one of them was circled in thick black ink. "We've got a problem," Carol said. "Decompression chamber stuck at 1,000 meters. Been down there for 3 days now and we need it fixed." I looked at the depth reading again. 1,000 meters was serious business. That was deeper than most of our regular operations. The pressure down there could crush a man if his equipment failed. "What happened to it?" I asked. "Control systems went offline during a routine maintenance cycle. The chamber's stuck in the down position and won't respond to surface commands. We've tried everything from up here." Carol pointed to a technical diagram clipped to the side of the chart. It showed the chamber's mechanical systems and electrical connections. Several components were highlighted in yellow. "The repair work has to be done manually. Someone needs to go down there and fix the control panel from the outside." I studied the diagram for a minute. The job looked straightforward enough. Replace some circuit boards, reconnect a few cables, maybe reset the main power coupling. Nothing I hadn't done before, just at a much greater depth than usual. "Most of our divers can't handle that kind of pressure," Carol continued. "The few who can are already on other assignments. That leaves you." He was right about the pressure. At 1,000 meters, the water pressed down with over 100 times the force you felt at sea level. Your equipment had to be perfect, and you had to know exactly what you were doing. One mistake and you'd be dead before you could call for help. "When do you need me down there?" I asked. "Today. The chamber's part of a critical system, and every hour it stays offline costs us money. Plus, if we don't get it fixed soon, we might lose the whole installation." I nodded. The job sounded challenging, but I'd been diving at extreme depths for over 10 years. My pressure suit was rated for 1,200 meters, and I'd tested it at those limits more than once. The technical work didn't worry me either. I'd repaired dozens of underwater systems over the years. "I'll need about 2 hours to prep my gear," I said. "Take whatever time you need, just get it done." Carol rolled up the chart and handed it to me along with a folder containing the technical specifications. The folder was thick, probably 50 pages of diagrams, part numbers, and safety protocols. "One more thing," he said as I headed for the door. "The pressure down there can play tricks on your mind. Stay focused on the work and don't let your imagination run wild." I'd heard that warning before. Extreme depth diving could cause nitrogen narcosis, which made some divers see things that weren't there or become confused about their surroundings. It was one of the reasons why deep water repairs required experienced personnel. "Understood," I said. I left Carol's office and went straight to the equipment bay. My diving suit hung on its rack next to the other deep water gear. The suit was a custom-built model with reinforced joints and triple redundant life support systems. I'd had it for 3 years and trusted it completely. The preparation process took exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. I checked every seal, tested all the electronic systems, and verified that my emergency backup equipment was functioning properly. The air mixture for the dive required a special blend of gases to prevent nitrogen poisoning at depth. My toolkit went into a waterproof case along with the replacement parts I'd need for the chamber repair. The circuit boards were sealed in protective packaging, and I double-checked each part number against the technical specifications. The dive boat was a 40-foot vessel designed for deep-water operations. The crew had it ready and waiting at the dock when I finished my equipment check. They helped me load my gear and run through the final safety checklist. The trip to the dive site took 35 minutes. The ocean was calm with light swells and good visibility. Perfect conditions for a deep dive. The boat's sonar showed the chamber's location clearly, a bright dot on the screen at exactly 1,000 meters below the surface. I suited up on deck while the crew prepared the dive platform. The suit felt heavy in the air, but I knew it would feel weightless once I entered the water. My helmet sealed with a soft hiss as the life support systems activated. "Radio check," I said into my microphone. Clear and strong, came Carroll's voice through the speakers. He was monitoring the dive from the surface control station. "Descending now," I said. I stepped off the platform and dropped into the water. The ocean closed over my head with a familiar rush of bubbles and muffled sound. My depth gauge read 0 meters as I began the long descent to the chamber. The first 100 meters passed quickly. Sunlight still filtered down from above, giving the water a deep blue color. Fish swam past occasionally, mostly small species that lived in the upper layers of the ocean. At 200 meters, the water began to darken noticeably. My suit lights automatically activated, casting bright beams ahead of me as I continued downward. The pressure gauge showed the increasing force pressing against my suit, but the reinforced material held perfectly. 300 meters. 400. The water was completely black now, except for the cone of light from my helmet. I checked my depth gauge every few seconds, watching the numbers climb steadily higher. At 500 meters, I paused to check my equipment and breathing mixture. Everything looked normal. The suit's heating system kept me comfortable despite the near-freezing water temperature. My air supply showed plenty of reserve for the work ahead. 600 meters. 700. The pressure was enormous now, but my suit handled it without any problems. I'd tested this equipment at these depths before, and it had never let me down. At 800 meters, I started looking for the chamber. My sonar showed it was still 200 meters below, resting on the ocean floor. The water was so dark that my lights only penetrated about 10 meters in any direction. 900 meters. The pressure gauge showed readings I'd only seen a few times before in my career. This was serious deep water territory, where only the most experienced divers could operate safely. At 950 meters, I could see the ocean floor below me. It was a flat expanse of sand and rock, mostly barren except for a few deep-sea creatures that scuttled away from my lights. 1,000 meters. My depth gauge showed the target depth exactly. I looked around and spotted the chamber about 50 meters to my left, a large cylindrical structure sitting upright on the seafloor like a metal tower. The chamber was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet tall and 8 feet in diameter. Emergency lights glowed dimly through small windows near the top, which surprised me. According to the technical briefings, the chamber should have been completely dark with all power systems offline. I swam closer to get a better look at the control panel I needed to repair. The chamber sat solidly on the ocean floor, its metal surface covered with a thin layer of marine growth that had accumulated over the months since installation. I pushed through the water toward the chamber, my fins cutting through the dark current as I closed the distance. The structure looked massive from this angle, easily the size of a small building sitting upright on the ocean floor. But something was off about it. Emergency lights were still glowing inside the chamber. That didn't make sense. Carl had told me the thing had been sitting down here for 3 days with its control systems offline. If the power was cut, those lights should have been dead. I slowed my approach and checked my depth gauge, still holding steady at 1,000 meters. The pressure felt fine. My suit was handling it without any problems. I moved up to the nearest window and peered through the thick glass. There was a body floating inside. The thing was bloated beyond recognition, drifting in the flooded chamber like some kind of grotesque balloon. What was left of the diving suit hung in tatters around the corpse, and the face, Jesus. The face was so swollen I couldn't tell if it had been a man or woman. The skin had turned a sickly gray-white color, and the whole thing just bobbed there in the red emergency lighting. My stomach lurched, and I had to fight to keep my breathing steady. Finding dead bodies wasn't part of the job description Carol had given me. I reached for my radio and switched to the surface channel. "Carol, this is Thomas. You copy?" Static crackled in my earpiece for a few seconds before his voice came through. "I copy, Thomas. What's your status down there?" "I'm at the chamber, but we've got a problem. There's a body inside this thing. Looks like it's been here a while." More static, then Carol's voice again, calmer than I expected. "Copy that. Probably one of the missing divers from the Meridian project. Guy named Harrison went missing about 3 weeks ago during a routine maintenance dive." I stared at the floating corpse through the window. 3 weeks underwater at this depth would definitely explain the condition of the body. "Carl, this changes things. I'm not sure I should be working on this chamber with a dead guy floating around inside." "Thomas, listen to me. That body isn't going anywhere, and we still need those repairs done. The chamber's been compromised for days now, and every hour we wait costs us more money. You're already down there. Your gear is working fine, and the job needs to get done." I looked at the corpse again. It had drifted closer to the window, and I could see more details I didn't want to see. The diving helmet was cracked, probably from the pressure when whatever happened to this guy went wrong. "Are you sure about this, Carol? This feels like something the authorities should handle." "The authorities already know about Harrison. They classified it as an equipment failure and closed the case. Our insurance company is breathing down our necks about this chamber, and if we don't get it operational again soon, we're looking at a massive financial hit. You're the only diver we have who can handle this depth." I floated there for a moment, watching the body drift in the red light. The whole situation felt wrong, but Carol was right about one thing. I was already down here, and the repair work needed to be done regardless of what was floating around inside the chamber. "All right, I'll continue with the repairs, but I want this logged properly. Dead body found in chamber, reported to surface, continuing with assigned work under direct orders." "Understood. Get the job done, Thomas." The radio went quiet, leaving me alone with the corpse and the steady sound of my own breathing in the diving helmet. I swam around to the side of the chamber where the control panel access was located, trying to keep the window with the floating body out of my direct line of sight. The access compartment was right where the technical diagrams had shown it would be. I pulled out my tools and started working on the external bolts that held the panel cover in place. The work was straightforward enough. Remove the cover, assess the damage to the internal systems, replace whatever components had failed. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing back toward that window. The emergency lights inside kept casting weird shadows, and the body seemed to shift position slightly each time I looked. Probably just the water current moving it around, but it was distracting as hell. I got the first bolt loose and moved on to the second one. The wrench felt solid in my hands, and the familiar routine of technical work helped calm my nerves. This was just another repair job. The fact that there was a dead diver floating nearby didn't change the actual work that needed to be done. The second bolt came free, then the third. I was making good progress despite the circumstances. Maybe Carol was right. The body wasn't going anywhere, and I could just focus on the repairs and get out of here. I removed the final bolt and carefully pulled the access panel cover away from the chamber. Inside, I could see the damaged control circuits that had caused the whole system to fail. Several circuit boards were clearly fried, and some of the connecting cables had been severed or damaged. It looked like a pretty standard electrical failure, probably caused by a power surge or water intrusion. I reached into my toolkit and pulled out the replacement components I'd brought down. The repair work would take maybe an hour if everything went smoothly. Replace the damaged boards, reconnect the severed cables, test the connections, and power the system back up. As I started working on the first circuit board, the emergency lights inside the chamber flickered for a moment. I glanced up from my work and looked through the window again. The body was still there, still floating in the same general area. The flickering lights made it look like the corpse had moved, but that was probably just an optical illusion. I went back to work, focusing on the precise movements needed to remove the damaged circuit board and install the replacement. The work required concentration, and I tried to block out everything else. The dead body, the eerie red lighting, the oppressive darkness of the deep ocean around me. The first board came out cleanly, and I slotted the replacement into position. The connections looked good, and I moved on to the second damaged component. This one was more complicated. The circuit board was partially melted, and some of the connecting pins had fused together. I'd have to cut away the damaged sections before installing the new part. I pulled out my cutting tool and started carefully removing the melted components. The work was delicate, and I had to make sure not to damage any of the surrounding circuits. One wrong move could fry the entire control system and make the chamber completely inoperable. The emergency lights flickered again, longer this time. I looked up and saw the body floating near the window, its bloated face pressed against the glass. The sight made me jerk backward, and I nearly dropped my cutting tool. The corpse's face was turned toward me, and for a split second it looked like the thing was staring right at me through the thick glass. But that was impossible. The guy had been dead for 3 weeks. It was just the way the emergency lighting was hitting the swollen features, making it seem like the eyes were focused on something. I forced myself to look away and concentrate on the repair work. Dead bodies didn't watch people. The pressure and isolation were just getting to me, making me see things that weren't there. Carol had warned me about nitrogen narcosis and the mental effects of deep diving. I finished cutting away the damaged components and started installing the second replacement board. The connections were more complex on this one, and I had to refer to the technical diagrams several times to make sure I was routing the cables correctly. The work was going well, but I kept finding myself glancing back at that window. Each time I looked, the body seemed to be in a slightly different position. Sometimes it was near the far wall, sometimes closer to the window, sometimes turned at a different angle. The emergency lights cast shifting shadows that made it hard to tell exactly where the corpse was at any given moment. I told myself it was just water currents moving the body around. Dead things floated, and the chamber was probably not completely sealed, allowing some water circulation that would cause the corpse to drift back and forth. There was nothing supernatural or threatening about a dead body moving with the current. But the rational explanation didn't make the sight any less disturbing. Every time I caught a glimpse of that bloated face in my peripheral vision, my heart rate spiked and my hands started to shake slightly. I had to keep stopping to steady myself and refocus on the technical work. I finished installing the second circuit board and moved on to the damaged cables. Several of them had been completely severed. Probably during I decided to push through and get the repairs done, even with Harrison's body floating right there in the chamber. The whole situation was messed up, but Carol was right. The job had to get finished. I swam over to the access compartment on the side of the chamber and pulled out my toolkit. The waterproof case opened with a soft click, and I grabbed my wrench to start removing the bolts on the control panel cover. The first bolt came off easy enough, but the second one was corroded and took some extra muscle to break free. The emergency lights kept casting that weird glow through the water, making everything look greenish and unnatural. Every few seconds I'd catch a glimpse of the body through my peripheral vision and have to force myself to look away. Focus on the work, I kept telling myself. Just get it done and get out of here. The third bolt was the worst, completely seized up from saltwater corrosion. I had to use a penetrating oil from my kit and wait a couple minutes for it to work before I could get the damn thing to budge. When it finally gave way, I nearly lost my grip on the wrench. The fourth and final bolt came off without much trouble, and I pulled the access panel away to expose the damaged circuits inside. The control board was a mess. Half the components were fried, and several cables had been cut clean through. Looked like someone had taken a knife to the wiring, which didn't make sense for a maintenance failure. I reached into my toolkit and pulled out the replacement circuit boards Carol had given me. The first one slid into place perfectly, and I used my screwdriver to secure it with the mounting screws. The connections looked good, and the LED indicators on the board lit up green when I powered it on. The second circuit board was trickier. The mounting bracket had been damaged, so I had to bend it back into shape before I could install the replacement. My hands were getting tired from working in the thick diving gloves, and the constant pressure at this depth was starting to wear on me. While I worked on the third board, the emergency lights flickered for a second. I glanced up at the chamber window and saw Harrison's body drifting slightly in the current. His face was turned away from me now, which was actually a relief. I didn't need to see those bloated features while I was trying to concentrate. The cable repairs were the most tedious part. I had to strip the insulation off each wire and splice in new sections where the old ones had been cut. My wire strippers weren't designed for underwater use, so everything took twice as long as it should have. The waterproof electrical tape was a pain to work with too. It kept wanting to stick to my gloves instead of the wires. I was about halfway through the cable repairs when the lights flickered again, longer this time. The whole chamber went dark for maybe 3 seconds before the emergency power kicked back in. During those few seconds of darkness, I couldn't see anything except the faint glow from my suit's work lights. When the chamber lights came back on, I forced myself to keep working on the wires. I had maybe 6 more connections to make, and then I could test the whole system. The sooner I got this finished, the sooner I could get back to the surface and away from this creepy situation. The fourth cable splice went smoothly, and I moved on to the fifth one. This wire had been cut in 2 places, so I had to install a longer replacement section. I measured it out carefully and made the connections, then wrapped everything in electrical tape to keep the salt water out. The final cable was the main power feed, and it was the thickest one in the bundle. Someone had really done a number on it. The cut was clean and deliberate, like they'd used heavy-duty wire cutters. I spliced in a new section and double-checked all the connections before wrapping it up. With all the repairs complete, I powered up the control panel and ran through the diagnostic sequence. The display lit up and started cycling through the system checks. Everything looked good. Pressure readings were normal, life support was functioning, and the chamber's position controls were responding properly. I was just finishing up the final diagnostic when the emergency lights flickered one more time. This time, when I looked up at the chamber window, Harrison's body had drifted closer to the glass. His face was turned toward me now, and even through the bloated, discolored features, I could see his eyes were open. That sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself it was just the water pressure and decomposition doing weird things to the corpse. Dead bodies did all kinds of strange stuff underwater. I'd heard stories from other divers about corpses that seemed to move or change position. I packed up my tools and sealed the access panel back in place. tightening all 4 bolts to the proper torque specification. The repair job was complete, and the chamber's control systems were fully operational again. Carol would be happy to hear that the 3-day nightmare was finally over. As I prepared to swim back to my ascent point, I took one last look at the chamber. The emergency lights were steady now, and all the system indicators showed green. Harrison's body was still floating there, behind the thick glass, but at least the chamber itself was working properly again. I gathered my toolkit and pushed off from the chamber structure, starting my swim back toward the dive line that would guide me to the surface. The repair had taken longer than I'd expected, but it was done right. The whole time I'd been working, I'd managed to keep my focus on the technical aspects of the job instead of dwelling on the disturbing presence of the corpse. The water around me was dark and cold as I swam away from the chamber, my suit's lights cutting through the blackness ahead of me. I could feel the weight of all that water above me, pressing down with tons of pressure per square inch. At this depth, even the smallest mistake could be fatal. I reached the dive line and clipped my safety tether to it, then began the long ascent toward the surface. The chamber grew smaller behind me as I rose through the water, its emergency lights becoming just a faint glow in the depths below. I kept working on the control panel, my hands moving automatically through the repair sequence I'd done dozens of times before. The replacement circuit board slid into place with a satisfying click, and I reached for my screwdriver to secure the mounting screws. That's when the emergency lights flickered. Just a quick flutter, like someone had bumped the power source. I glanced up from my work, squinting through my diving mask at the chamber's interior. The lights steadied, casting their pale glow through the murky water inside. Harrison's body floated where it had been before, arms spread wide, face turned toward the ceiling. I went back to tightening the screws. The sooner I finished this job, the sooner I could get away from this place. My hands were getting tired from working in the thick diving gloves, and the constant pressure at this depth was starting to wear on me. Just a few more connections to make, then I could seal up the panel and head for the surface. The lights flickered again, longer this time. I stopped working and looked through the window more carefully. Something seemed different about the body, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it had drifted a little closer to the glass. Bodies did that sometimes. The decomposition process created gases that could shift the position slightly. I turned back to the control panel and started working on the final cable connection. The wire strippers felt clumsy in my gloved hands, but I managed to strip back the insulation and twist the copper strands together. Almost done. Just needed to wrap this connection with waterproof tape and test the system. The emergency lights went out completely. For about 3 seconds, I was working in total darkness, except for the small LED light mounted on my diving helmet. Then the lights came back on, brighter than before, flooding the chamber with harsh white light. I looked through the window again, and my blood went cold. The body had moved. Not just drifted, moved. Harrison's head was turned toward me now, facing the window directly. His bloated features were clearly visible through the glass, skin pale and waterlogged, eyes clouded over. But there was something wrong with his face. He was smiling. Not the slack-jawed expression of a corpse, but an actual smile. The corners of his mouth were turned up in a deliberate grin, lips pulled back to show yellowed teeth. I stared at the face, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Nitrogen narcosis could cause hallucinations at this depth. The pressure, the isolation, the stress of working next to a dead body, it all added up. But the smile was definitely there. I forced myself to look away and focus on the repair work. Just finish the job and get out of here. My hands were shaking now as I wrapped the electrical tape around the wire connection. The tape kept slipping, and I had to start over twice before I got it right. When I looked back at the window, the smile was wider. Harrison's face had changed again, the grin stretching across his bloated features like someone had grabbed the corners of his mouth and pulled them apart. His clouded eyes seemed to be looking right at me, though I knew that was impossible. Dead eyes couldn't focus on anything. I dropped my tools and pushed back from the control panel, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't nitrogen narcosis. This wasn't a hallucination brought on by pressure and stress. The corpse inside that chamber was moving, changing, responding to my presence. The emergency lights flickered once more, and in that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw Harrison's hand press against the glass from the inside. When the lights came back on, his face was right against the window. That horrible smile stretched so wide it looked like his face might split in half. His dead eyes were staring directly into mine, and his mouth was moving like he was trying to say something. I couldn't hear anything through the water and the chamber walls, but I could see his lips forming words over and over again. The same word, repeated endlessly, with that grotesque smile never leaving his face. Welcome. 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 I backed away from the chamber window, my heart hammering against my ribs as Harrison's smile stretched wider across his bloated face. The emergency lights flickered again, casting weird shadows through the water, and that's when I caught something moving in my peripheral vision. I turned my head to the left, squinting through my diving mask. Dark shapes were drifting through the water maybe 30 feet away. At first I thought it might be debris from the chamber, or maybe some kind of sea life, but the way they moved didn't look right. Too deliberate, too purposeful. I rotated slowly in the water, scanning around me, and felt my stomach drop. There were more of them. 3, maybe 4 shadowy figures approaching from different directions. They looked human-shaped, but moved in this weird, flowing way that made my skin crawl. Like they were swimming, but not really swimming, if that made any sense. The emergency lights from the chamber kept flickering, making everything look like some kind of underwater strobe light show. 1 second I could see the figures clearly. The next they'd disappear into the darkness, only to reappear closer than before. I couldn't make out any details. No faces, no diving gear, nothing that would tell me what the hell I was looking at. I tried to focus on the closest one, maybe 20 feet to my right. It was definitely human-shaped, but something about the way it moved through the water was all wrong. Normal divers kick with their fins, use their arms for steering. This thing just glided, like it was being pulled by some invisible current that only affected it. My breathing was getting faster, which was bad news at this depth. I forced myself to slow down, to think rationally. Maybe it was nitrogen narcosis messing with my head. At 1,000 meters, the pressure could definitely play tricks on your mind. But I'd been down this deep before, and I'd never seen anything like this. Another flicker from the emergency lights, and when they came back on, the figures had moved closer. Now I could count 5 of them, spread out in a rough circle around me and the chamber. They weren't rushing toward me, just moving with that same eerie, flowing motion that made my skin crawl. The shadowy figures were getting closer. I could see more details now. They were wearing diving suits, or what was left of them. The suits looked old, damaged, with tears and holes that should have flooded them completely. But somehow these things were still moving, still functioning. One of them was close enough now that I could make out its face through the diving mask. What I saw made me want to scream. The face was bloated and pale, just like Harrison's, but the eyes were completely black. No pupils, no iris, just solid black orbs that seemed to absorb the light from the chamber. I realized I needed to get the hell out of there. Whatever was happening down here, whatever these things were, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I reached for my ascent line, the rope that would guide me back to the surface. But when I looked up, I couldn't see it anymore. The emergency lights flickered again, longer this time. In the darkness, I felt something brush against my leg. Not hard, just a gentle touch, like someone trying to get my attention. When the lights came back on, one of the figures was right next to me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. Its face was turned toward me, and I could see its mouth moving behind the diving mask. The same word, over and over, just like Harrison. "Welcome." I kicked hard with my fins, pushing myself away from the thing, but it didn't try to follow. It just hung there in the water, watching me with those black, empty eyes. All of them were watching me now, 5 figures spread out around the chamber. All of them perfectly still, except for their mouths forming that same word. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my emergency ascent device. I had to get to the surface, had to get away from whatever this was. But as I prepared to activate the device, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figures weren't just random shapes in the water. They were wearing diving suits I recognized. Old models, the kind we'd used on deep water operations years ago. And on the chest of the closest one, I could make out a name patch through the murky water. Morrison. Not Carol Morrison, my boss. This was someone else, someone whose name I'd heard before in the stories about divers who'd gone missing on deep water jobs. Morrison had disappeared 3 years ago during a routine maintenance dive. They'd never found his body. I looked at the other figures, trying to make out more details. Another name patch came into focus. Chen, then Rodriguez. Names I'd heard whispered in the equipment bay, stories about divers who'd gone down and never come back up. The emergency lights flickered one more time, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt the water around me shift. When the lights came back on, the figures had moved again. They were closer now, forming a tighter circle around me in the chamber. I had to move. Had to get away from this nightmare before whatever had happened to these divers happened to me. I activated my emergency ascent device and started rising through the water, but slowly, carefully. Even in a situation like this, ascending too fast would kill me just as surely as whatever these things were. As I rose, the figures below me started moving again. They weren't following me exactly, but they were shifting position, rearranging themselves around the chamber, like they were preparing for something. The last thing I saw before the chamber disappeared into the darkness below was Harrison's face, still smiling, still mouthing that word. And around the chamber, the 5 shadowy figures had arranged themselves in a perfect circle, their black eyes all turned upward, watching me ascend into the depths above. I dropped my tools and pushed back from the control panel, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sight of Harrison's face pressed against the glass, that impossible smile stretching wider, made my stomach lurch. I couldn't stay here another second. I kicked hard with my fins, propelling myself away from the chamber. The emergency ascent device was still clipped to my belt. I'd activated it during the encounter with those shadow figures, but I'd been moving too slowly, too carefully. Now I needed to get to the surface fast, but not so fast that I'd kill myself with decompression sickness. 20 meters up from the chamber, I forced myself to slow down. My depth gauge read 980 meters. I had a long way to go, and if I screwed up the ascent, I'd end up as dead as Harrison and the others. The thought made me check below again. The figures looked smaller now, but I could still make out their shapes in the dim emergency lighting from the chamber. My breathing was coming too fast. I focused on controlling it, counting each inhale and exhale. Panic would use up my air faster, and I needed every bit of it for the long trip to the surface. The regulator felt strange in my mouth. Everything felt strange after what I'd just seen. At 900 meters, I made my first decompression stop. 3 minutes felt like 30. I kept looking down, expecting to see those shadow figures rising toward me, but they stayed put. Whatever they were, they seemed content to remain in the depths. The chamber's lights flickered once, then went steady again. I resumed my ascent, checking my dive computer every few seconds. 850 meters, 800, 750. The water around me was getting lighter, less oppressive. I could feel the pressure decreasing gradually as I rose, but my ears still felt like they were being squeezed in a vice. Another decompression stop at 700 meters. This time, I couldn't help myself. I looked down again. The chamber was just a faint glow now, barely visible in the darkness below. The figures were gone, or at least too far away to see. I told myself that was good news, but part of me wondered if they were following me up through the black water where I couldn't see them. My air supply was holding steady. I'd been down there longer than planned, but not long enough to put me in real danger. The ascent was eating into my reserves, though. Every breath felt precious. 600 meters, 550, 500. I was making good time between the mandatory stops, but each pause felt endless. During the stop at 450 meters, I thought I saw movement below me, just a flicker in the darkness. I stared until my eyes watered, but nothing materialized. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe something was following me after all. The water was definitely getting brighter now. At 300 meters, I could actually see the faint outline of my hands without the diving light. The surface was still a long way up, but for the first time since I'd seen Harrison's face against that window, I started to believe I might actually make it. 250 meters. 200. The decompression stops were getting longer now, more critical. I had to fight the urge to skip them and rocket straight up. My body wanted to get as far away from those depths as possible, but my brain knew that rushing would kill me just as surely as whatever was down there in the dark. At 150 meters, I could see actual sunlight filtering down through the water. It looked like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Golden rays cutting through the blue, promising safety and sanity in solid ground somewhere far above. 100 meters, 75, 50. The light was getting stronger with every meter I climbed. My final decompression stop was at 15 meters, and I could see the hull of the dive boat above me, a dark shadow against the bright surface. Carol would be up there waiting, probably wondering why I was taking so long. I had no idea how I was going to explain what I'd seen down there. The moving corpse, the shadow figures, the way Harrison had smiled and mouthed that word over and over. Welcome. Like he was inviting me to join him and the others in whatever they'd become. The stop at 15 meters felt like the longest yet. I kept checking my dive computer, willing the minutes to pass faster. My air supply was getting low. Not dangerously low, but low enough that I'd be cutting it close if anything went wrong during the final ascent. Finally, the computer cleared me for the surface. I kicked upward, watching the boat's hull grow larger and more distinct. The water around me was bright blue now, shot through with shafts of sunlight that made everything look clean and normal and safe. 10 meters. 5. 3. I could see the dive platform extending down from the boat's stern and Carol's legs as he stood waiting for me. The surface was right there, so close I could almost taste the fresh air. I broke through with a gasp, the sudden transition from the regulated breathing of the diving apparatus to open air hitting me like a physical shock. The sun was blindingly bright after the darkness of the depths. I treaded water for a moment, blinking and trying to adjust to being back in the world of the living. Carl was already reaching down to help me onto the platform. I grabbed his outstretched hand and let him pull me up, my legs shaky from the long ascent and the adrenaline that was still coursing through my system. "How'd it go down there?" Carol asked as I sat heavily on the platform, water streaming from my diving suit. "Get the repairs finished?" I pulled off my diving helmet and looked up at him. His face was expectant, waiting for a routine report about a routine job. I opened my mouth to tell him about Harrison, about the shadow figures, about the way the dead had smiled and welcomed me to join them in the depths. But the words wouldn't come. In the bright sunlight, with the normal sounds of the boat's engine and the crew moving around, it all seemed impossible. Like something I'd dreamed or imagined during the long, dark hours underwater. I looked back at the water where I'd just emerged. It was calm and blue and gave no hint of the horrors that waited 1,000 meters below. I broke through the surface gasping, the sudden transition from the regulated air of my diving apparatus to the open atmosphere hitting me like a shock. The brightness above water made me squint after spending so long in the depths, and I treaded water for a moment, trying to get my bearings. The dive boat bobbed gently about 20 feet away, and I could see Carol standing on the platform, his hand shielding his eyes as he watched me surface. "Thomas," he called out, reaching down toward the water. "Grab the ladder." I swam over to the platform, my movements still shaky from everything that had happened below. Carol extended his hand and I grabbed it, letting him help pull me up onto the dive platform. My legs felt unsteady as I stood, the solid surface beneath my feet feeling strange after hours underwater. "Jesus, you look like you've seen a ghost," Carol said, studying my face. "What happened down there?" "Carol, something's not right down there," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I expected. "The chamber repair went fine, but there's something else. Something I need to tell you about." He crossed his arms and leaned against the boat's railing. "All right, let's hear it." I ran my hand through my damp hair, still trying to process what I'd witnessed. There was a body in the chamber. You told me about Harrison, but that wasn't the worst part. The body, it moved, Carol. It smiled at me. And there were others. Carol's expression didn't change much, which surprised me. I'd expected him to look skeptical or concerned, but he just nodded slowly. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. "Harrison's body was floating in the chamber when I got there. At first it seemed normal, for a corpse that's been underwater for weeks. But while I was working on the control panel, the emergency lights kept flickering. Every time they came back on, the body had moved. First it was just drifting, but then..." I paused, remembering that horrible smile. Then it was facing me directly, smiling. Its mouth was moving like it was trying to talk. Carol pulled out a small notebook from his shirt pocket and started writing. "What else?" There were 5 other figures. Shadow figures moving through the water around the chamber. They were wearing old diving suits, and I could see name patches. Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez. These were divers who went missing, weren't they? 3 years ago for Morrison, Carol said without looking up from his notes. Chen disappeared 18 months back. Rodriguez vanished last year during a routine maintenance dive. The casual way he rattled off those details made my stomach drop. "You knew about this? You knew there were bodies down there?" Carol finished writing and looked up at me. "What did the figures do? Did they try to communicate?" They formed a circle around the chamber. One of them got close enough that I could see its face, bloated, pale, with completely black eyes. It mouthed the word "welcome" at me. just like Harrison was doing. They didn't follow me when I ascended, but they watched me the whole time. How did the body's expression change? Describe it exactly. I stared at him. Carol, are you listening to me? These weren't hallucinations. The corpse was moving, smiling, trying to communicate. And you're taking notes, like this is routine. He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. Thomas, you're not the first diver to report encounters like this at extreme depths. The deep ocean does things to people's minds. Pressure, isolation, nitrogen narcosis, the psychological stress of being so far from the surface. It can create very vivid experiences. This wasn't nitrogen narcosis, I said firmly. I know what that feels like. This was real. The body moved. The figures were there. Carol nodded. I'm not dismissing what you experienced. But consider this. You were working at 1,000 meters for several hours, under significant stress, with a decomposing body visible the entire time. The mind can play powerful tricks under those conditions. I wanted to argue with him, but part of me wondered if he might be right. The whole experience felt surreal now that I was back on the surface. The normal sounds of the boat, the feeling of solid deck beneath my feet, the bright afternoon sun, it all made what happened below seem impossible. Have other divers reported the same things? I asked. Similar experiences, yes. Moving shadows, faces in the water, voices. It's more common than you might think at depths below 800 meters. The human brain isn't designed to function in that environment for extended periods. I started unzipping my diving suit, needing to get out of the heavy gear. So, you think I imagined all of it? I think you experienced something that felt very real to you. Whether it was psychological or something else, I can't say for certain. But I will say this. You completed the repair work successfully. The chamber is operational again, and that's what matters. The way he deflected my question bothered me. It felt like he was avoiding giving me a straight answer about whether he believed me or not. Carol, those name patches I saw, Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, you confirmed they were real people who went missing. How do you explain that? You've heard their names before. Stories get passed around among the diving crews. Your subconscious mind could have pulled those details up during a stress-induced hallucination. I finished getting out of my diving suit and sat down heavily on the platform bench. My hands were still shaking slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold, the adrenaline, or the memory of those black eyes staring at me. I know what I saw, I said quietly. Carol sat down next to me. I believe you saw something. The question is what it actually was. The mind is powerful, Thomas. It can create experiences that feel completely real, especially under extreme conditions. We sat in silence for a few minutes while I tried to process everything. The boat rocked gently in the swells, and I could hear the crew moving around on the upper deck, probably preparing for the trip back to shore. There's another assignment coming up next week, Carol said eventually. Deep water work again, 1,500 meters this time. The pay is double your usual rate. I looked at him in disbelief. You want me to go back down there? After what I just told you? You're one of the best deep water divers we have. And like I said, these kinds of experiences aren't uncommon. Most divers learn to work through them. Work through them? The psychological effects of extreme depth diving. It's part of the job. You develop coping mechanisms, learn to distinguish between what's real and what's your mind playing tricks. The offer hung in the air between us. Double pay was significant money, more than I'd make in 3 months of regular diving work. But the thought of going back down to those depths, of potentially encountering those figures again, made my chest tight. "What kind of work?" I asked, surprising myself. "Salvage operation. There's equipment down there that needs to be recovered. It's a 2-day job, but the depth requires someone with your experience level." "I need to think about it," I said. Carol stood up and headed toward the boat's cabin. "Take your time, but don't take too long. The window for this job is narrow." I remained sitting on the platform, watching the water and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and the crew was already pulling in the dive lines and securing equipment for the trip back to port. I sat on the dive platform for a long time after Carol disappeared into the cabin, staring at the water that looked so calm and innocent from up here. My diving suit felt heavy and uncomfortable, but I couldn't bring myself to take it off yet. The whole experience down there felt like something out of a nightmare, but the more I thought about it, the more real it became. Carol's offer kept running through my head. Double pay for going even deeper than I'd just been. Part of me wanted to tell him to find someone else, to pack up my gear and never look at the ocean again. But there was something else pulling at me. Something I couldn't quite explain. Those shadow figures, Harrison's moving corpse, the way they'd all said, "Welcome." It wasn't just some hallucination brought on by nitrogen narcosis. Two knew what I'd seen down there, and now I needed to understand what it meant. When Carol came back out 20 minutes later, I was still sitting in the same spot. He had a thermos of coffee and handed me a cup without saying anything. The hot liquid felt good going down, and it helped clear some of the fog from my head. "I'll take the job," I said. Carol nodded like he'd been expecting that answer. "Good. But before we get into the details, I need to tell you some things about what you experienced down there." I set my coffee cup down and looked at him. "You mean about the bodies?" "About all of it." Carol pulled out a different notebook, this one thicker and more worn than the first. "You're not the first diver to report seeing things at those depths. In the past 5 years, we've had 12 divers come back with stories similar to yours." 12? I felt my stomach drop. "What happened to them?" 3 of them quit diving immediately and moved inland. 2 kept diving, but refused to go below 600 meters. 4 disappeared on subsequent dives. Carol flipped through pages in his notebook. The other 3 kept diving deep water missions until they had what we call episodes. "What kind of episodes?" Carol showed me a page with handwritten notes. "Psychological breaks. One diver surfaced claiming he'd been recruited by the dead divers to join their crew. Another came up speaking in voices that weren't his own. The third one tried to go back down without any diving equipment." I stared at the notes, trying to process what he was telling me. "And you still want me to go deeper?" "Because you came back rational," Carol said. "Most divers either break completely or become obsessed with returning. You're scared, which is the right response, but you're still thinking clearly." The boat's engine started up, and I felt us begin moving toward shore. Carol kept talking while the crew secured equipment around us. "The next dive site is at 1,200 meters. We've lost contact with a research station down there, and we need someone to investigate what happened to it." "Research station?" I asked. "What kind of research?" Carol closed the notebook and looked out at the water. "The kind that was supposed to be shut down 3 years ago. The kind that might explain what you saw today." I thought about Harrison's smile, about the way those shadow figures had moved through the water like they belonged there. How many divers have gone missing at this new site? 7 in the past 6 months. Jesus. I rubbed my face with both hands. "And you think I can handle whatever's down there?" "I think you're the only one who's seen them and lived to tell about it without losing your mind." Carol stood up and headed back toward the cabin. Take tonight to think about it. We'll need an answer by tomorrow morning." I spent the rest of the boat ride back to shore thinking about what Carol had told me. 12 divers with similar experiences, 4 disappearances, 3 psychological breaks. The numbers kept running through my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something much bigger than a simple diving accident. When we docked, I helped the crew unload equipment, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about those missing divers, about the research station that was supposed to be shut down, about the way Harrison had looked at me through that chamber window. That night, I went home to my small apartment near the harbor and tried to research what Carol had told me. I searched online for information about deep-sea diving incidents, missing divers, and underwater research facilities. Most of what I found was either classified or heavily redacted, but I did find a few news articles about divers who disappeared during deep-water operations. One article from 2 years ago mentioned a diver named Morrison, who'd vanished during a routine maintenance dive. Another article from last year described the search for a diver named Chen, who'd been working on an underwater installation when contact was lost. The third article I found was about Rodriguez, who disappeared 3 years ago during what was described as a classified marine operation. Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, the same names I'd seen on those shadow figures' diving suits. I closed my laptop and sat back in my chair, feeling a chill run down my spine. Whatever was happening down there, it had been going on for years. And now Carol wanted me to dive even deeper, to a place where 7 more divers had vanished. But despite everything I'd learned, despite the fear that was eating at me, I found myself wanting to go back down. Not because I was brave or because the money was good, but because I needed to understand what I'd witnessed. Those figures hadn't just been hallucinations or the effects of nitrogen narcosis. They'd been real, and they'd been trying to tell me something. The next morning, I called Carol before he could call me. "I'm in," I said when he picked up, "but I want to know everything about this research station before I go down there." "Fair enough. Meet me at the facility in an hour, and I'll show you what we're dealing with." I drove to the diving facility, with my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Part of me couldn't believe I was doing this, but a bigger part of me knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever was down there in the deep water, it had already claimed too many divers. Maybe I could be the one to finally figure out what was happening. Carol was waiting for me in his office with a stack of files and what looked like architectural blueprints spread across his desk. When I walked in, he gestured for me to close the door behind me. "The research station was built 8 years ago," he said without any preamble. Officially, it was designed to study deep-sea pressure effects on human physiology. Unofficially, they were conducting experiments on divers to see how long they could survive at extreme depths. I sat down across from his desk and looked at the blueprints. The station was massive, with multiple chambers connected by tunnels and what appeared to be a central control facility. "What kind of experiments?" I asked. Carol pulled out a file with a red classification stamp on it. They were testing the limits of human endurance underwater, keeping divers submerged for weeks at a time, exposing them to pressures that should have killed them, studying the psychological effects of prolonged isolation in the deep. "That's insane. It gets worse." Carol opened the file and showed me photographs of the station's interior. They were also studying what they called post-mortem diving capabilities. Essentially, they wanted to know if dead divers could still be useful for underwater operations. I stared at the photographs, feeling sick. "You're telling me they were experimenting on corpses?" "Dead divers, specifically. They had a theory that the pressure and cold at extreme depths could preserve bodies in a way that would allow them to continue functioning for limited periods. The room felt like it was spinning. "And you think that's what I saw down there? Some kind of experiment gone wrong?" Carol nodded grimly. "The station was shut down 3 years ago after a government investigation, but we've been getting reports of activity down there ever since. Lights moving around, equipment operating on its own, and now divers going missing." I looked at the blueprints again, trying to understand the layout. "So you want me to go down there and find out what's still operating?" "I want you to find out what happened to the 7 missing divers, and I want you to shut down whatever's still running down there." Carol handed me another file, this one containing detailed technical specifications for the diving equipment I'd need. The suit was more advanced than anything I'd used before, with enhanced life support systems and emergency ascent capabilities. "This isn't just a salvage operation," I said, reading through the equipment list. "No, it's not." Carol leaned back in his chair. "It's a cleanup operation, and you're the only diver we have who's encountered these things and lived to tell about it." I spent the next 3 hours going over the mission details with Carol. The dive would take me to 1,200 meters, deeper than I'd ever gone before. The station was located in an underwater canyon that provided natural protection from currents, but also made emergency ascent more difficult. Carl showed me sonar images of the station taken from a remote submersible. The facility appeared to be intact, with several chambers still showing signs of power. But there were also anomalies in the sonar readings, shapes moving around the station that didn't match any known marine life. "When do we go?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. The weather window is perfect, and we can't afford to wait any longer." I nodded and started gathering up the files Carol had shown me. "I'll need tonight to prepare my gear and go over the technical specifications." "Thomas," Carol said as I reached for the door handle, "be careful down there. Whatever those things are, they're not just random ghosts or hallucinations. They're organized, and they seem to have a purpose." I left Carl's office with my head spinning from everything I'd learned. The research station, the experiments on dead divers, the 7 missing people. It all painted a picture that was far worse than anything I'd imagined when I first saw Harrison's moving corpse. That evening, I spent hours preparing my equipment and studying the station blueprints. I memorized the layout of the chambers, the location of emergency exits, and the technical specifications of the life support systems. I also prepared additional safety equipment that wasn't on Carol's list: extra cutting tools, emergency beacons, and a backup air supply that could get me to the surface if everything else failed. As I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about those shadow figures and the way they'd moved through the water. If Carol was right about the experiments, then those weren't just the ghosts of dead divers. They were something else entirely. Something that had been created in that underwater laboratory. The more I prepared for the dive, the more determined I became to find out what was really happening down there. 7 divers had vanished, and if I didn't do something about it, more would follow. Whatever those things were, whatever they wanted, I was going to find a way to stop them. I checked my gear one more time before starting the descent. The dive boat rocked gently above me as I slipped beneath the surface, the familiar weight of the water pressing against my suit. Carol had briefed me on the new location, 1,200 meters down, deeper than I'd ever gone before. The research station was supposed to be completely abandoned, but the sonar readings showed something was still active down there. The first 100 meters went by quickly. I controlled my breathing and watched my depth gauge climb steadily. 200 meters, 300. The water around me grew darker with each passing moment, and I switched on my helmet lights to cut through the gloom. At 500 meters, I paused for my first decompression stop. The silence down here was absolute, except for the steady rhythm of my breathing apparatus. I looked up and could barely make out the faint glow of sunlight filtering down from the surface. Below me, there was nothing but black water stretching into the abyss. I resumed my descent, checking my dive computer every few seconds. 600 meters, 700, 800. The pressure was incredible at this depth. I could feel it pressing against every inch of my suit. My movements felt sluggish, like I was swimming through thick syrup instead of water. At 900 meters, I passed the depth where I'd encountered Harrison and the shadow figures. My heart rate picked up as I remembered their bloated faces and unnatural smiles. I forced myself to stay calm and keep descending. Whatever was waiting for me at 1200 meters, I needed to be ready for it. 1000 meters. I was back in familiar territory now, but I didn't stop. The water pressure was enormous, and I had to work harder to move through it. My suit's joints creaked with each movement, and I could hear the steady hiss of my air supply working overtime to maintain proper pressure. 1100 meters. The darkness was complete now except for the narrow beam of my helmet lights. I checked my air supply. Still good. But I'd need to be careful about how long I spent at the bottom. Emergency ascent from this depth would be extremely dangerous. 1200 meters. My depth gauge beeped softly to signal I'd reached the target depth. I looked around, sweeping my lights in a wide circle, but saw nothing except empty water. According to the sonar readings, the research station should be directly below me. I descended another 20 meters, and finally saw it. The structure emerged from the darkness like something from a nightmare. It wasn't just one building. It was a complex of interconnected modules spread across the ocean floor. In the center stood what looked like a main research facility, surrounded by smaller structures arranged in a perfect circle. As I got closer, I realized the smaller structures were decompression chambers. 8 of them, each one identical to the chamber where I'd found Harrison. They were positioned around the central facility like spokes on a wheel, connected by thick cables and what looked like pressurized walkways. I swam toward the nearest chamber, my lights illuminating the metal hull. Through the porthole window, I could see it was flooded with seawater. But unlike Harrison's chamber, this one had lights on inside. Dim emergency lighting cast an eerie glow through the murky water that filled the chamber. I pressed my face mask against the glass and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a body floating inside, just like before. But this one wasn't drifting aimlessly with the current. It was moving with purpose, its hands working on some kind of control panel mounted on the chamber wall. The figure wore a diving suit that looked old and damaged, with tears in the fabric that allowed seawater to flow freely in and out. I watched in horror as the corpse turned toward the window. Its face was bloated and pale, just like Harrison's had been, but its eyes were open and alert, tracking my movement as I floated outside the chamber. When it saw me watching, its mouth stretched into that same impossible smile. I pushed back from the window and swam to the next chamber. The same scene greeted me. Another body, another diving suit, another set of working hands manipulating controls. This corpse also turned to look at me when I approached, its smile widening as it recognized my presence. Chamber after chamber, the pattern repeated. Each one contained a dead diver who moved and worked as if they were still alive. I recognized some of the suits. They matched the descriptions Carol had given me of the missing divers. Morrison's distinctive red stripe along the helmet, Chen's modified air hose configuration, Rodriguez's custom tool belt. But there were others too. Divers I didn't recognize, wearing suits from different eras. Some looked like they'd been down here for years, their equipment corroded and their suits barely holding together. Yet they all moved with the same deliberate purpose, working on equipment I couldn't identify. I swam toward the central research facility, my hands shaking inside my diving gloves. The main structure was massive, at least 3 stories tall and built like a fortress to withstand the crushing pressure at this depth. Lights glowed in several windows, and I could see movement inside. Through the largest window, I watched as more figures moved through flooded corridors. They weren't just floating randomly. They were walking along the floor as if the water didn't affect them at all. Some carried tools, others operated machinery that hummed with electrical power despite being completely submerged. I counted at least 12 bodies moving through the facility. All of them wore diving suits in various states of decay. All of them moved with that same unnatural coordination, and when they noticed me watching through the window, they all turned toward me with those horrible, knowing smiles. One of them approached the window from inside. It was wearing a suit I recognized from the missing persons files, a distinctive yellow stripe that belonged to a diver named Patterson, who disappeared 4 years ago. Patterson's face was pressed against the glass now, his bloated features twisted into a grin that was far too wide for any human mouth. He raised one hand and pressed it against the window from the inside. Then he mouthed a single word, just like Harrison had done. "Welcome." The other figures in the facility began moving toward the windows. They lined up along the glass walls, all of them smiling, all of them watching me with those dead, black eyes. Some of them were operating control panels. Others were manipulating mechanical equipment I couldn't identify. That's when I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just an abandoned research station. It was still operational, still running experiments. But the researchers weren't human anymore. They were the missing divers, transformed into something else, something that could survive and work at depths that would kill any living person. The lights in the facility suddenly grew brighter, and I heard a mechanical humming sound through the water. The dead divers inside were activating something, bringing the station fully online. Through the windows, I could see them moving with increased urgency, their hands flying over control panels and instrument displays. In the chambers around the central facility, the other corpses had stopped their individual tasks and were now watching me as well. 16 pairs of dead eyes, all focused on my position. 16 impossible smiles, all welcoming me to join them in whatever they'd become. I watched the transformed divers through the chamber windows, their bloated faces turned toward me with those horrible smiles. But something had changed. They weren't just watching anymore. They were moving with purpose, their decayed hands working control panels inside their flooded chambers. That's when I saw the mechanical arms. They extended from the central structure like massive tentacles, each one as thick as my torso and equipped with articulated joints that moved with frightening precision. The arms unfolded from hidden compartments in the station's hull, reaching outward into the dark water around me. I kicked hard with my fins, trying to put distance between myself and the station. The arms moved faster than I could swim, cutting through the water with mechanical efficiency. One of them swept past my helmet, close enough that I could see the corroded metal and the hydraulic pistons that powered its joints. I changed direction, swimming toward what I hoped was open water, but another arm intercepted my path. The transformed divers in their chambers pressed their faces against the glass, watching my escape attempt with those same welcoming smiles. Their eyes tracked my movement as if they were coordinating the mechanical pursuit. The third arm came from below, rising up beneath me like some deep-sea predator. I tried to dodge, but the mechanical claw at its end clamped down on my diving suit's chest plate with a metallic clang that echoed through my helmet. The arm began retracting, pulling me back toward the station. I fought against it, kicking and twisting, but the mechanical grip was too strong. Through the chamber windows, I could see the transformed divers nodding approvingly, their mouths moving in unison as they mouthed that same word, "Welcome." I was being dragged toward an empty chamber at the edge of the complex. Its airlock was already cycling open, revealing a flooded interior identical to the ones housing the other divers. The mechanical arm positioned me directly in front of the opening. That's when I remembered the emergency cutting tool clipped to my belt. I fumbled for it with my free hand, my thick diving gloves making it difficult to grip the small device. The mechanical arm continued pulling me toward the chamber, and I could see the airlock beginning to close behind me. In a few seconds, I'd be trapped inside with whatever process had transformed the other divers. The cutting tool activated with a high-pitched whine that cut through the water. I pressed it against the mechanical arm's hydraulic line, and sparks flew as the plasma cutter sliced through the metal tubing. Fluid erupted from the severed line, creating a dark cloud in the water around me. The mechanical arm's grip loosened, and I pulled free just as the chamber's airlock sealed shut. Alarms began sounding throughout the station, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the water and into my bones. The emergency lights flickered from white to red, bathing the entire complex in an ominous glow. The other mechanical arms thrashed wildly, no longer coordinated in their movements. The transformed divers in their chambers were no longer smiling. They pressed against their windows with obvious agitation, their mouths opening and closing as if they were shouting, though I couldn't hear them through the water and glass. I swam away from the damaged arm, looking for any weakness in the station structure. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before, a section of the foundation where the metal plating had buckled, probably from years of water pressure and corrosion. The support beams were exposed, and I could see stress fractures running through the concrete base. I reached for my emergency kit, pulling out the small explosive charges that every deep-water diver carried for emergency situations. They were designed to blast through debris or create escape routes, but I had a different plan. Swimming down to the foundation, I placed the first charge against the main support beam. The transformed divers had noticed my activity and were frantically working their control panels, trying to regain control of the mechanical arms. Two of the arms had stopped thrashing and were moving toward me again. I placed the second charge at a stress point in the concrete, then the third against a secondary support beam. The mechanical arms were getting closer, their movements more coordinated, as the divers inside the chambers worked to override the damage I'd caused. The fourth and final charge went against the foundation's weakest point, where the metal plating had separated from the concrete. I could see hairline cracks spreading through the structure, evidence that the station's integrity was already compromised. I swam back as far as I could and activated the detonator. The explosion was muffled by the water, but the shock wave hit me like a physical blow. My diving suit's pressure sensors screamed warnings as the concussion passed through my body. Debris erupted from the foundation in a cloud of concrete dust and twisted metal. The station shuddered, and I watched as the support beams buckled under the weight of the massive structure. The central facility tilted to one side, its hull groaning as metal stressed beyond its limits. The mechanical arms went limp, their control systems severed. Through the chamber windows, I could see the transformed divers pressing against the glass with desperate urgency. Their smiles had vanished, replaced by expressions of rage and panic. They pounded on their windows, but the thick glass held. The station's collapse accelerated. The central facility broke away from its foundation and crashed down onto the surrounding chambers. Glass shattered, and water rushed into spaces that had somehow remained air-filled. The emergency lights flickered once more and went dark. I watched as tons of debris buried the entire complex, sealing the transformed divers in their chambers beneath layers of twisted metal and concrete. The mechanical humming stopped, replaced by the settling groans of a structure destroying itself. Within minutes, the research station was nothing more than a pile of rubble on the ocean floor. The emergency lights were gone, leaving only the beam from my helmet to illuminate the destruction. No movement came from beneath the debris. No signs that anything had survived the collapse. The water around me was filled with sediment, and floating particles. But it was quiet again. The horrible welcoming smiles were gone, buried under the weight of their own facility. I kicked hard against the collapsing station, pushing myself away from the twisted metal and shattered glass that was raining down through the water. My suit felt wrong. There was a hissing sound coming from somewhere near my left shoulder, and I could feel cold water seeping in around the seal. The emergency ascent device was still clipped to my belt, but I didn't dare use it. Not with a compromised suit. A rapid ascent would kill me just as dead as staying down here. I checked my depth gauge, still at 1,200 meters. The longest ascent of my life stretched ahead of me, and I was already losing air through the leak. Every breath felt precious now. I had to get this right, or I'd end up like those poor bastards in the chambers, except I'd be dead for real. The first 100 meters went okay. I kept my breathing steady, watching the gauge climb slowly upward. 1,100 meters. The water around me was getting lighter, but not by much. At this depth, even a small amount of sunlight filtering down was a blessing. At 1,000 meters, I had to stop. My first decompression break couldn't wait any longer. The leak in my suit was getting worse. I could hear the hiss getting louder, and the cold water was spreading across my chest. 3 minutes felt like 30. I kept looking down, half expecting to see those mechanical arms reaching up through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just black water and the faint glow of debris settling on the ocean floor. 900 meters. 800. The leak was really bothering me now. Water had gotten into my helmet somehow, and I had to tilt my head to keep it from covering my regulator. My hands were shaking from the cold, making it hard to check my instruments. At 700 meters, I made another stop. The water was definitely getting brighter now, but my vision was starting to blur around the edges. That wasn't good. Could be nitrogen narcosis, could be the cold, could be oxygen toxicity from the damaged suit. I couldn't tell anymore. 600 meters. 500. I was starting to feel dizzy and my breathing was getting shallow. The regulator felt loose in my mouth like it wasn't sealing properly. Every breath was an effort now. At 400 meters, I almost blacked out during the decompression stop. My head was pounding, and I kept seeing spots in my vision. The water inside my helmet was up to my chin now. I had to crane my neck back to keep breathing. 300 meters. 200. The sunlight was getting stronger, but I felt like I was drowning inside my own suit. My emergency air supply kicked in automatically. The main tank must have been compromised worse than I thought. At 100 meters, I could see the hull of the dive boat above me. It looked impossibly far away, wavering through the water like a mirage. My final decompression stop at 15 meters lasted forever. I kept drifting in and out of consciousness, fighting to stay awake. When my dive computer finally cleared me for ascent, I barely had the strength to kick upward. The boat's hull grew larger and larger until I broke through the surface with a gasp that turned into a cough. Water poured out of my helmet as I struggled to stay afloat. Jesus Christ! Carol's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. Get the medical kit. Now! Hands grabbed me under the arms, hauling me onto the dive platform. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. Someone was shouting about hypothermia and suit breach. The world kept spinning, and I couldn't focus on anything. Stay with me, Thomas, Carol said, his face appearing above mine. You're gonna be okay. But I wasn't okay. I could feel myself slipping away as they stripped off my damaged suit and wrapped me in thermal blankets. The last thing I remembered was the sound of a helicopter approaching, its rotors beating against the sky. I woke up 3 days later in a decompression chamber at the Naval Medical Facility. The walls were white and curved, and there was a constant hissing sound from the air recycling system. My body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Every joint ached, and my lungs burned with each breath. A doctor explained that I'd suffered severe decompression sickness and oxygen toxicity. The emergency ascent had nearly killed me. They'd had to put me in the chamber immediately and slowly bring me back to normal pressure over 72 hours. Carl visited on the second day. He sat in a chair next to the chamber's viewing port, looking older than I remembered. "You ready to tell me what really happened down there?" he asked through the intercom. So I told him everything. The research station, the transformed divers, the mechanical arms, the explosives, all of it. Carol listened without interrupting, taking notes in that same worn notebook he always carried. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "That facility was shut down 5 years ago," he finally said. "Government investigation found they were conducting illegal experiments on deep-sea divers, trying to see how long humans could survive at extreme depths. Some kind of military application, they said." "What kind of experiments?" Carol looked uncomfortable. "They were testing the effects of prolonged exposure to pressure and isolation, seeing if they could create divers who could work at depths that would kill normal people. The program was classified, but word got out when divers started disappearing." "And you knew about this?" "I suspected. Too many good divers went missing on jobs near that site. But I never imagined..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Those weren't hallucinations, Carol. Those divers were still down there, still working." "I believe you," he said quietly. "The question is, what do we do about it?" But I already knew what I was going to do. When they finally let me out of the chamber, I drove straight to my apartment and started packing. I couldn't face the ocean anymore. Every time I looked at water, even a bathtub, I saw those smiling faces pressed against the glass. I moved to Denver 2 weeks later, about as far from the ocean as I could get without leaving the country. Found work as a maintenance technician at an office building. Nothing glamorous, but it kept me on dry land. The nightmares started about a month after I moved. Always the same dream. I'm back in the chamber, watching Harrison's bloated face smile at me through the glass. Sometimes I'm trapped in one of those chambers myself, and the other divers are welcoming me to join them. I wake up gasping, feeling like I'm drowning in my own bed. I tried therapy for a while. Told the doctor I had PTSD from a diving accident. Couldn't exactly explain about the walking corpses and the underwater research station. She prescribed sleeping pills and suggested I find a new hobby. The pills help sometimes, but they don't stop the dreams entirely. And they don't stop me from checking the locks on my apartment door 3 times every night, or from avoiding swimming pools and even large bathtubs. 6 months after Denver, I was doing okay. The job was steady, I'd made a few friends, and the nightmares were down to maybe twice a week. I thought I was getting better. Then I saw the news report. A research vessel had discovered wreckage on the ocean floor off the coast where I destroyed the station. The reporter said it appeared to be some kind of underwater facility that had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. No mention of bodies or survivors. But what caught my attention was the interview with the salvage team leader. He mentioned that sonar had detected movement in the wreckage, large objects shifting around in the debris field. The team was planning a follow-up dive to investigate. I turned off the TV and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours, staring at the wall. They were still down there. The explosion hadn't killed them. Maybe nothing could. And now more divers were going down to investigate. I thought about calling Carol, warning him somehow. But what would I say? That the dead divers I'd encountered were probably still active in the wreckage. That the salvage team was walking into the same nightmare I'd barely escaped. In the end, I did nothing. I couldn't face going back to that world, even to save other people. I was a coward, and I knew it. The nightmares got worse after that. Now I dream about the salvage divers too, their faces joining the collection of smiling corpses that welcome me every night. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of seawater in my mouth, even though I'm 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. I still live in Denver, still work the same maintenance job, still check my locks 3 times every night. The ocean changed me in ways I'm still discovering, and I know I'll never be the same person who used to love diving into the deep blue water. Some mornings I catch myself staring at the mountains outside my window, grateful for all that solid rock between me and the sea. But even here, safe on dry land, I can still hear the sound of water rushing into a damaged diving suit. And I still wake up feeling like I'm drowning in the darkness, 1,200 meters below the surface.